Welcome to Standing on Business with Eric Foss. I'm your host, Eric Foss. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Standing on Business with Eric Foss. I'm your host, Eric Foss. All right, guys, today we're going to talk about a few different topics. We're actually going to get into the federal sentencing guidelines, what a safety valve is it cooperation or not? We're also going to talk about the different type of paperwork that they do check in the federal system and what says what and what to look for. So let's get into it. The first thing I want to discuss is the federal sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums. I want to explain the difference. In 2005, Booker was decided on, I believe, sometime around January 2005. It came from a case off Blakely in Washington State, and it made the federal sentencing guidelines were no longer mandatory. They were only advisory. Now, that did not affect mandatory minimums, and I'll explain to you why. What it means by advisory guidelines is this. Back before Booker was passed, say your guidelines were 188 months to 230 months, 35 months, something like that. Okay? What that meant was that was the mandatory, you would have to get at the least that 188 months up to 235. That was mandatory. But that was determined to only be advisory. The reason why it does not affect mandatory minimums is because the federal sentencing guidelines are part of the judicial system. Okay? The mandatory minimums are part of the legislative system of United States of America. You got legislative, judicial, and executive. Those are your three branches of government, okay? So mandatory minimums have nothing to do with the federal sentencing guidelines because mandatory minimums are not part of the judicial system. That's why judges cannot go beneath them. But once the federal sentencing guidelines became advisory, what that means is they can the judge can now put in mitigating factors or aggravating factors. So in other words, if your guidelines are 188 to 235 months, the judge there might be some mitigating factors. Maybe you had a minor role in the case. Maybe your criminal history overstates itself, which could happen a lot of times. These are called 3553A factors. So by using that, the judge can deem what he deems a fair sentence for you. So instead of 188 months, he might give you 135 months, okay? And he is allowed to do that. But say in a case like that, your mandatory minimum was 120 months, he would not be able to go below that because the mandatory minimum is set by Congress. Okay, now, there are ways to go below the mandatory minimum, okay? Now, the first way that a judge can go beneath the mandatory minimum is the obvious way. That's a 5K1, or that is a Rule 35B, or any type of cooperation, telling, snitching, whatever you want to call it, ratting, whatever. So that's pretty much obvious. What that does is that lifts the whole mandatory minimum. It's basically gone. There's no longer a mandatory minimum. So the judge can sentence you to whatever the hell he wants. Okay? Sometimes they'll give these people very good sentences, like you see with Sammy the Bull Gravano, 5 years for 19 unalivings. Okay. Now, what other ways is there beneath the mandatory minimum? It's a very controversial topic that we'll talk about right now, and it's called the safety valve. Now, a lot of people believe that the safety valve is the same thing as a cooperation deal. And the reason why is because part of the safety valve, now this is for basically, it used to be for first-time offenders, but I believe they changed it. And now it is for people with like a small criminal history. So basically first-time offenders. The person can not have a gun involved in the case. Like they can't have a gun involved with them. No violence. And they can't be the leader, the organizer. They can't be the head of the indictment, okay, and receive a safety valve. But say you're none of them things and they qualify for the safety valve. What they must do is they must go and sit down with the government and discuss their role in that actual crime. Whatever they're indicted for, whatever them and their co-defendants, whatever. Okay, now, a lot of people will consider that ratting because they sat down with the government. But that's the, all your organized crime, like mob and stuff like that. That's a no-no. You can't do that. Just a whole lot of people consider it that. But it's really not that. It's really not that. Now, I know firsthand of a person who got a safety valve on my case, and they did not tell. I know they didn't tell because if they would have told, I would have been fucked. Let me give you the rundown. I was fighting my drug amount, blah, 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 whatever. I had a co-defendant, never been in trouble before, nothing. He was out. I was detained. He was out since he didn't have a record or whatever. Well, his mandatory minimum was 10 years because he was pled guilty to over 5 kilos of cocaine. Now, his guidelines range was less than his mandatory minimum. So in other words, his guideline range was like 84 months, but his mandatory minimum was 120 months. So now, by doing his safety valve, he will be allowed to be sentenced to his actual guideline range, which you should be anyway, I guess, whatever. But his mandatory minimum, like I said, was 120 months, and his guideline range was 84 months. So you're talking close to 4 years difference. It's close to a 4 year, no, let me see, 84, 120, 60, it's 3 year difference, something like that, So anyway, so that the person I'm talking about chose to take the safety valve. Now, here's how I know that they did not rat. Because at this same time, I was actually close to going to trial in this same case. And I was fighting my drug amount because they had me charged at first with over 5 kilos of cocaine, actually over 50 kilos, but 5 kilos is a statute. And I was not copping out to nothing like that. I was going to go to court, and fight that. I had a strategy where I was going to fight a different type of way where I would sit down and go to trial and not say that I'm not a drug dealer, but say that I'm not responsible for all of drugs. So what the government did was they actually changed my indictment, what is called superseding the indictment, to be any drug amount. So now I have to there's no way to beat the case, but I still have to beat this drug amount. So anyway, the person who took the safety valve was actually one of the people that I dealt hands-on with and could have cooked me over that drug amount. Now, here's how I know that they didn't tell, because I called my friend on the street, and they told me they had seen that person, my co-defendant, and my co-defendant said to call him. I called him that day. My co-defendant says to me, hey, listen, when I went in, because he was on pretrial, obviously, he said when he went in, the government pulled him up and asked him, said, look, you could turn this safety valve into a cooperation deal, and you never got to go to prison. Not even for the 84 months or nothing. So I asked him, I said, well, what the fuck did you say? Because that's a hell of a deal for somebody, especially somebody who's never been in trouble. Yeah, I feel bad to this day. He kind of yelled at me. He's like, man, what the fuck you think I said? But I told him no. I'm like, are you sure? He's like, man, if you don't fucking believe me, I'll be in court Tuesday. I'm going away. Hung up the phone. Sure enough, that Tuesday, he went into court and he got sentenced to 84 months, which means he did get the safety valve credit, but he did not get no cooperation, no nothing like that. And I wound up beating the drug amount. So did he rat? No, he did not rat, but he did get the safety valve. Did he sit down with the government and tell him his role in our crime or whatever? Yeah. Now, even if I had went to trial, that would not have came in. He would have had to, unless he decided to cooperate. So it could not hurt me in any type of way. It could not hurt anybody in any type of way. So it's a thin line with that now with these safety valves, because now some people will say, yeah, that means that they did this. They said that. It all depends, man, because a lot of times people will say they got a safety valve, but they wound up going and cooperating and stuff like that. But when this guy I'm talking about got a legitimate safety valve, no, he didn't cooperate. He got his guidelines, which he should have got, and he went and he did his prison time. Kudos to him. Now, let's talk about the different types of paperwork when you get into the federal system. Now, when you go into the federal system, everything changes. Things change all the time. And basically what it used to be, before I even caught my Fed bid, right around the time I caught my Fed bid in '03, is when they started getting rid of the PSIs. Now, what the PSIs are is they just tell your whole criminal history. They tell if, the discovery in your case, if you got locked up, if you went over to talk to them, I guess, all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So, anyway, and also the PSI recommends your sentence. So in other words, if you were cooperating, the PSI will recommend the sentence and say that the reason why they're recommending it is due to their cooperation or whatever. So you'll be able to see that. So what happened was the feds banned PSIs. You're no longer allowed to have your PSI. You can go in the back and look it over with your counselor or whatever, but you can't have it. There's ways to get it in, stuff like that, but technically you can't have it, and it's pretty tough, situation. So things change. So now it went to transcripts, which would be your sentencing minutes, your sentencing transcripts, which is still decent, but remember, as people are going back to court and testifying on people and doing this and doing that, snitching or whatever, you don't think they're telling the government, hey, they check transcripts, hey, they check this, hey, they check that, hey, I need some. So in other words, the government has to protect their informants or whatever. So what they have started doing in certain areas, I believe, and I don't know where, I don't know which areas, it might be all areas, to tell you the truth, but they've started giving 2 sentencing minutes. In other words, what they do is they came out with a thing called a sealed supplement. And this is it's not part of your plea agreement, but it is attached to your plea agreement, okay? Now, either your sealed supplement will say if you didn't cooperate, all it'll be is like a blank page. It'll say your case number and it'll say not a cooperation agreement. That's it, and it'll be blank. But if you did cooperate, it will have all the same headline or whatever. It won't say not cooperate. It'll say, I guess, whatever. It'll just say everything and however many pages of what the person agreed to cooperate to do. What if they got to testify on people, if they agreed to that, if they agreed to that. Now, they started the sealed supplement in 2008. Okay? So, there is that now. So in other words, when they go in for sentencing, they really don't got to go in depth and discuss all that cooperation stuff and all, because it's already dealt with on the sealed supplement. So that clears up the transcript thing. There's also other paperwork that you can use. A lot of times people use a JNC. What that is a judgment called judgment and commitment. Now, it's not really the JNC that is paperwork, okay? That's not. What it is the last 2 pages are called the statement of reasons. Statement of reasons. And what that means is the one page, it will just have a bunch of check boxes. If the person cooperated, if they're a sex offender, if they're violent, if there's guns, so it'll have all these check boxes. Whatever applies to that person will be checked off. And then on the other page, it will have written out what their sentence was and why they received that sentence. In other words, say they received a sentence for and they didn't cooperate or something, and say their guidelines were 22 years and they got a 16-year sentence because of mitigating circumstances. What it would say was defendant or whatever sentenced to 16 years, reason being 3553A factors, 3553A, okay? And it will say the mitigating circumstances. Their record overstated itself, the guidelines were too harsh, whatever. Now, there is also, remember, just like 3553A, there's also 3553E. Now, 3553E is a person who cooperated. So if they cooperated, it would say due to 3553E and 5K1 or Rule 35B or something like that. So that would say that, not technically in the JNC, but in the statement of reasons that is attached to the JNC. So you could basically use that to figure that out. Now, when you're getting into these things, man, it's like you'll hear situations like I've heard on Vlad TV, and I did a video on it, about Chuck Zito. And all they talked about was he got a Rule 35. First thing everybody thinks, Rule 35 is a rat. Yeah, that's true. A Rule 35B. Rule 35B. Rule 35A, what that is, a Rule 35A would mean this. Say I went into court and my guidelines were 22 years, but my statutory maximum that's set by Congress is 20 years, and the judge gives me 22 years. That is an illegal sentence. I would have to file a Rule 35A to correct the illegal sentence. Just like 5K1, yes, that's a rat. But there's also a 5K2, which is like extraordinary circumstances. You got terminal cancer, stuff like that. So all of this stuff, these people are spouting and stuff, they don't understand that it's not just the 5K that means it. It's not just the Rule 30. It's not the 3553. What it is the letter afterwards, or the number. 5K1, that's a rat. 5K2, that is not a rat. 35B, that is a rat. 35A, that is not a rat. Okay? 3553A is not a rat. 3553E is a rat. So you have to know what you're actually reading. Now, the way this federal sentencing guidelines work is they have your offense level, which only is 43 levels, okay? And they have your criminal history category, which is only 6 categories. So it goes up with your offense level and over. So that's how they would determine it, okay? Another thing in the federal system that people don't understand is, and this has actually happened to me, when I caught my first federal bid in 2003, my record was worse, and I was in a higher criminal history category than when I caught my last one in 2018. How is that, Eric? You got to be lying, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. Doesn't make sense. I know it doesn't make sense, but here's why. In the federal system, as they figure out where your criminal history category is, if you have been out of prison 15 years for any offense, for even for a 3-point offense, which is your worst offense, you can't get worse than a 3-point offense. And what a 3-point offense means is you went to prison for over a year, okay? Anything like that. Now, if you have been out of prison and never went back to prison for that same crime, you don't have to be off probation, you don't have to be but you just released from prison for that actual crime, never went back to prison for that crime, okay? 15 years. After 15 years, that goes away. Basically, it don't go away, it's still on your record, but you get 0 points for it. You cannot be enhanced as a career offender, anything like that for it anymore after 15 years. So in other words, when I first caught my first Fed bid, I was like a criminal history category 5. You know what I mean? They technically were arguing 6. They were arguing career offender and everything like that, but I wasn't. I had a consolidated case and I had a formal order of consolidation. But when I got sentenced, Booker had just passed, so the judge gave what he deemed a fair sentence. I had a 5-year mandatory minimum and I wound up with 145 months, which is 12 years, 1 month. Okay? So with that being said, the next time I went, in 2018, I was only a criminal history category 3. For real, a 2, because they held a point against me that they shouldn't, but let's just say 3. The reason why is because the 3-point offense and all the other little bullshit that gave me little points here and there was well over 15 years old, so it could no longer be used. So now I was like closer to a first-time offender on my second Fed bid than I was on my first. Doesn't make sense, but that's just the way it is. You know, if you ever want to get into that, you can read a book called Busted by the Feds. You got to get the updated version and stuff like that. And they give you everything right down to everything just right, perfect. You know what I mean? So that's basically how it works. But like I said, with the mandatory minimums, they have nothing to do with the federal sentencing guidelines. That is federal sentencing guidelines are part of the judicial system, okay? The judicial branch of government. The mandatory minimums are part of the legislative branch of government, okay? That's how that works. So when you hear people saying certain things and then they'll say this and that, a lot of people are trying to be accurate, they're trying to be correct, but they really don't know what they're talking about. They haven't been involved in these things. You know what I mean? So, and especially with the paperwork and stuff like that, like I said, it's always going to change. It's always going to change because, like I said, you got people going back to court. What do you think? They're not telling the government? Another thing, fake paperwork. Yes, there's tons of fake paperwork. In other words, you got a guy, say for instance, he's going back to court and he's testifying on somebody and the government really wants this person or whatever. Now he's in a penitentiary or he's in a prison, just any prison, you know. You don't think that he's going to tell them to give him some type of paperwork to take back, some type of paperwork to take back so he could have an excuse why he was out for court? And you don't think they're going to give it to him? Of course they're going to give it to him. Where do you think they make the paperwork at? Right there, at the courthouse. That's where the paperwork's made, so they can make you anything. So that's how a lot of times guys will come back to court. They'll have some fake paperwork, whatever, things like that. So it's always, it's like a cat and mouse battle, basically. Because they're always going to try to keep up with what the convicts are trying to figure out. That's another reason why down where I'm from, in Baltimore, in our federal court, they seal all of our like RICOs and conspiracy cases. They seal them on everybody, Here's the reason why. Because before, they might say it's 4 of you guys and you guys already are suspecting one guy cooperated, but everybody copped out and you can't get no paperwork and I'm like, I don't want them, but you're just suspecting it. Now you go and you look up the case and you see that you guys, the 3 of you guys who you know are good, your shit's open and this last guy's is sealed. What does that tell you? That would tell you he most likely cooperated. So now, just to get around that, they just, on these drug conspiracies, RICOs and all, they just seal everybody's. Okay, they seal everybody's. Now, can it come back open? Yes, it can, just like mine is. The reason why, both of my cases, I've appealed them. Like tried to get out, like or compassionate release or a 2255, something like that. So now that means I open my case up and it becomes public, especially if they publish the opinion, which they have in my cases. Now, that's how sometimes people will get caught as being cooperators or whatever, because especially when the pandemic hit, that's when this compassionate release stuff really started kicking on. Okay, so what happened is when you file for that, the government's going to have a rebuttal. You're going to have your reasons to be released. Obviously, if you're a cooperator, you're going to put in your reasons to be released that you cooperated with them. Obviously, if you have a lawyer, a good lawyer, he will put that in there. Also, they will detail out your case. You know, the government will in their response. They'll say, you know, they'll just put up the statement of facts of what happened and everything through the case, how you behaved in prison, if you're, you know, whatever. So a lot of times, some people wouldn't file compassionate release because they knew what was going to happen. But like some people didn't know, and that's how they got caught. You know what I mean? So like LexisNexis, that's a good thing to have in search on LexisNexis, old cases, things like that, and certain people's cases, because you can see the details, especially if somebody's appealed them, you know, and if it's got anything to do with cooperating or anything like that. So let me see, what else? A lot of people say docket sheets and all. They use docket sheets and Pacer and all that stuff for paper. That's docket sheet just means you went to court, just like any criminal in the United States of America, whether he was whatever or whatever. But now, with the guidelines and everything like that, it has become more lax, and the laws are changing actually for the better, especially in nonviolent drug offenses. Like back before with crack, it was 100 to 1. Now it's 18 to 1. Also, on all your drugs, they gave a 2-level reduction. When I first caught my federal sentence in 2003, my 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 offense level would have been a 24. But since I caught it in 2018, it was only a 22 because they reduced everything by 2 points. So it was a 22. When you plead guilty, they take off 3 levels for pleading guilty. So you go down 3 offense levels. So I wound up being a 19, category 3, criminal history category 3, sentence in range of 37 to 46 months and received 42 months. So that's basically how that works nowadays. You know, back beforehand, it would have been a 24. So I would have pled guilty. I'd have been a 21, criminal history category 3 or whatever. And so it might have been a little bit more time. It definitely would have been more time, but I'm not sure. Like maybe an extra 18 months, something like that. You know, anywhere like that could have got. So that helps. And it actually helps when you get higher up on the guideline, because when you're down in the 21s and stuff, like I said, it's only 43 levels. It's only 43 levels. You know, so fucking 43 just says life all the way across. All criminal history categories. Life, 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 life. You know what I'm saying? Some people are off the charts. You know, that's just how it is. Anyway, so I hope I broke that down decent for you guys today. Where, remember, mandatory minimums are not part of the judicial system. They're part of they're not part of the judicial branch of government. They're part of the legislative branch. The guidelines are part of the judicial branch. That's why they are advisory, and the judge has the ability to go up and down on whatever he deems a fair sentence, but he cannot go beneath that mandatory minimum unless cooperation or a safety valve. Or there might be something with other extreme circumstances, but those are the main two. And like I said, the safety valve, that's a touchy subject. A lot of people look at it like this, like that. I know for a fact that the one guy in my case who got it, he didn't rat. You know what I mean? I know that he didn't, but you know, other people have had other cases. Plus, you also got to remember, guys might say they got a safety valve, but they never even got a safety valve. They were actually just cooperating. Or, as I told you about the guy in my case, he had the safety valve, but when he went down there to take his piss test or whatever, they kind of bum rushed him and asked him if he wanted to turn that safety valve into a cooperation agreement and be willing to, you know, go against me on this drug amount or whatever. You know, he refused to do it, obviously. But that's what I'm saying. So a lot of times, maybe that's how that turns into that, and people get a bad name on that. But, you know, there's so many things to figure out and stuff. Basically, when you go into federal prison, what you just do is you just watch. That's all you got to do. Just watch. In about 3 days, you'll figure out who everybody is and how it goes and who you're going to be around and everything like that. You know, who's what, who's the troublemaker, who's this, who's that. All right, guys, thanks for coming in today. And remember, until next time, always stand on business.